the fiery collision of 5 fully loaded passenger airliners, what could have been, on this podcast of Taking Off. Hello and welcome to the Taking Off podcast. I'm Dan Milliken. I'm here with
Christy Wong.
Christy, glad to have you in studio this time, not just on phone.
Yeah, no, it's good to be here.
Okay, we are talking about what? This podcast is the one you wanted to do the most.
Yeah, this one actually really hits home for several reasons. This is the worst air crash that never happened.
The worst that never happened. All right, tell me more.
Okay, so oftentimes we hear about these terrible air crashes that at any moment could have been stopped. Okay, so we did the one last time where we talked about the Tenerife. Okay. And we talked how there were several links in the chain and how if any one of those links had been broken, this terrible accident would have never happened, and there would have been just hundreds of people whose lives would not have been lost that day. This is one of those cases where the link was fortunately broken by a hair.
Right. Okay. So set the stage. What happened?
Okay. So it's super late at night. Also, I take special interest in this story because this happened on the same day I got my private pilot certificate.
Oh, wow. 2017.
July of 2017. There was an Air Canada that was coming into San Francisco late at night. Okay. And the pilots had been working they had a long duty day. They were coming in, and runway 28 left at San Francisco was closed, and so they were using runway 28 right. It was a nice, clear evening, and so they gave the Air Canada visual approach, clearance for a visual approach. And so they were coming in lined up with what they thought was the runway, but instead they were lined up with Taxiway Charlie. And on Taxiway Charlie were like 4 other aircraft waiting to depart. And as they were coming in, some of the other pilots noticed while they were sitting there in Taxiway Charlie, hey, this guy appears to be lined up with us.
Okay, do you want to play the tape?
Yeah, let's go ahead and play the tape so that we can get a feel for what was set up here.
Okay, I have edited out silences, so it's not in real time, but pretty close. Here we go.
Good evening, Air Canada 759 with you. Have a message, reach visual 28 right.
Canada 759, San Francisco, Santa 28 right, clear to land, wind 2708.
Go on 28 right, Air Canada 759. And Tower, just want to confirm this Air Canada 759. We see some lights on the runway there. Across the runway, can you confirm a clear to land?
Air Canada 759, confirmed clear to land, runway 28 right. There is no
so that's our
right,
first indicator that something is not right.
Air Canada 759.
Where's this guy going?
Second
He's
indicator.
on the taxiway. Air Canada, go around.
In the go around, Air Canada 759.
759, looks like you were lined up for Charlie there. Fly heading 280, climb maintain 3000.
Heading 280, 3000, Air Canada 759.
All right,
then
that's it.
Yeah, they come around and they land on the appropriate runway with no issues. But I love the nonchalant, looks like you were lined up with Charlie there by the air traffic controller. Not really, I don't think he computed internally just how significant that situation was.
Well, let's talk about the significance, because people go, okay, well, I mean, he didn't land on it. I mean, I'm sure they were separated by quite a bit, but no, they weren't. Let's talk about how close that actually came. What are the numbers?
I think they were, 14 feet?
14 feet is what it said, the closest it came to colliding with one of the aircraft.
Yeah, 14 feet. So
So
here's the reason why, too. It's the same situation with the whole FedEx and Southwest and some of those near misses where they were climbing over. When you put the power into the thrust levers, it takes a few seconds. There is about a 6-second delay for the power to start making the aircraft do what you're commanding it to do. So they were still coming down even as they put in the power, and now they're starting to climb out.
Well, and I'm showing that even as they put in the power, they still descended about 25 feet
Yeah.
during those few seconds.
Yeah. And that's exactly what happens. You put in the power, and the aircraft is still descending because now it's got to take, like I said, it takes a few seconds for it to actually start responding to that input command.
Okay, so how close it came was 14 feet?
14 feet, which we're sitting in the studio right now. It's probably from here to the wall. Like, it's not
Right.
that far. So people are saying, well, how could they line up with the taxiway? How could they not see airplanes? There was actually another incident back in 1992-ish. It was the U.S. Air and the SkyWest, where it was at night or about to be at night. And the SkyWest was sitting on the runway, and he was told to basically position and hold, which is line up and wait now. He's just sitting on the runway waiting for clearance to take off, and the controller forgot about them. And at the same time, she gave clearance to land to the U.S. Air. I think it was U.S. Air that was coming in, if I remember correctly. But either way, they were coming in, and they couldn't see because the runway lighting and everything, they literally could not see that little SkyWest there, and they wound up landing on top of them and caused a whole bunch of deaths, including deaths on the U.S. Air. So, same situation here. The pilots are lined up for the taxiway, but they can't see, they really can't differentiate that those are airplanes because they don't have their strobes or anything on. They're just sitting there with their taxi lights on. They look like runway lights or taxiway, or you know what I mean?
Okay, let's talk about that. For the non-pilot out there, non-airline pilot out there, your airplane at night sitting on a taxiway short of the runway, what lights are on?
Just the taxi lights and like our standard nav lights.
So nav lights, position lights.
Yeah, position lights. Mm-hmm.
And taxi lights are on, not landing lights.
Right, just the taxi. And in fact,
And taxi lights are white.
taxi lights are only turned on if we're physically moving.
Oh, so these planes were sitting static on the taxiway
Yes.
waiting for this plane to land on 28 right.
Right.
So they did not have their taxi lights on.
Probably not. They might have had some other lighting or whatever, but the protocol is to turn the taxi lights on when we're moving, so that way we can see what we're driving toward effectively. But if you're stopped, then you don't need to see around you. We set the parking brake, turn all the lights off, except for like the navigation position lights.
So just the position lights. So red and green lights are, and the taxiway is lined with, again, for the non-pilot, describe the colors.
The taxiway lights are typically green or blue. It depends on what they're being used for, but effectively your navigation lights are going to blend in with some of those lights, and you're coming in from far away. Plus, you're moving in closer. Nighttime presents a few different optical illusions that you have to be
Right.
aware of, but there's other things that are contributing to this incident as well.
Well, and we'll get to that in just a minute, but let's finish setting the stage here for those that don't understand that. Excuse me. There were 4 airplanes on the taxiway. One had done a right turn and was perpendicular to the runway on the hold short. Correct?
I believe so.
And then there were 3 that were lined up
Behind it, yeah.
behind it, parallel. So facing. Towards what essentially is final approach. So the second plane, which was the first one that was lined up coming down, they saw this plane coming in towards them. They did what?
They spoke up.
And they turned on.
They turned on their lights.
They did turn on their lights.
Yeah, they turned on their lights because they were like, hey, I think they wanted to make it known to the Air Canada pilots, hey, you guys are not lined up with the runway. You guys are lined up with us. So so that's one way that they broke
the chain. Right. They turned on their lights.
They turned on their lights, and then they spoke up.
And they spoke up.
And to the air traffic controller's credit, because I don't think you could really see where you know what I mean, that they were specifically lined up with the correct whatever.
Right.
But he just said, you know what? Just go around. We're just going to send you around and bring you back in.
He did say he saw it. He saw that they were close over.
Right, yeah. But when they're further out, you can't tell which one they're
Yeah, the controller
lined up
cannot
with.
tell that he's not lined up.
But as he got closer
for the runway.
you could tell there just was no hesitation there.
Well, and the Air Canada pilot did testify later that he realized he felt something was wrong.
Which is why he said earlier, he was like, hey, we just want to confirm that we're clear.
Because it looks like there's traffic on there.
Yeah, it looks weird. It's like, well, okay, it does look weird because you're not where you're
Lined
supposed to
up.
be. Exactly.
Okay, so the Air Canada pilot realized it wasn't great, but there were other problems with Air Canada. You mentioned fatigue. Also, what's this about the ILS and all that?
Yep. So it was a nice, clear evening. They were cleared for the visual approach. Because of that, they failed to put in the ILS.
Well,
which
let's again, for the non-airline pilot or non-pilot, they were cleared for the visual approach. What does that mean to a non-pilot?
Literally, it's exactly what it says. You can land visually.
You don't need instruments.
Right. And exactly. You see the runway, you land on the runway. Easy peasy, right? We do it all the time. It's not a big deal. But what we always do, or what we typically do, what I always do.
Well, what you always do is it's standard practice among the airlines. Well, let's go. What do you always do?
We back it up with an instrument procedure, whether it's an ILS, which is the instrument landing system that gives us lateral and vertical guidance.
Right.
Or we back it up with an RNAV procedure, which could be either the LNAV, VNAV, which is lateral and vertical as well, but it's just GPS based. And if we don't have that, we'll just back it up with just lateral guidance, which could be an LNAV, or it could just, if the ILS is not working, one of the components of an ILS is the localizer. And so we'll go into airports sometimes that don't have the full ILS, but they have the localizer, which gives us lateral guidance. We'll back it up just to make sure that we're lined up with the right runway. So we'll do a visual backed up by the ILS.
So had Air Canada, the pilots have had that as a backup, they would have been able to just quick glance when they saw something was wrong. They didn't feel good about it, and they asked for the confirmation that they were cleared to land. Had they looked down, they would have seen that their lateral guidance was showing them off.
Correct. Yeah, they had not put in the ILS for runway 28 right.
Okay. So then what were the other factors? You mentioned fatigue.
Right. So they were basically landing, their body clocks were Toronto time, Toronto, Canada. So they were effectively at the time in San Francisco, it was 3 a.m., which is during that window of circadian low for pilots.
Okay.
And so that did contribute toward fatigue. And I'm trying to remember exactly how long they had been flying for, but I do know that they had not received enough rest in the previous day or two. And so they were definitely, they had accumulated fatigue over that time. So it's almost the equivalent of drinking alcohol at that point. They've tested people. They've done a lot of scientific research on individuals when they get to this level of fatigue. And it's actually like having 3 drinks or something. Don't quote me on that because I don't know the exact number, but it's a very similar state of being impaired.
And, an interesting comment that was made by a retired pilot who saw this was that, and quote, probably came close to the greatest aviation disaster in history.
Yeah. So had these links not been broken, we're talking 5 aircraft, because it wouldn't have just been this airplane hits one airplane or maybe 2 airplanes.
It would have been fire everywhere.
Absolutely. It would have pushed all these airplanes into each other and caused just absolute mass chaos and destruction. We are so fortunate that this did not happen.
Over 1,000 passengers were at imminent risk.
Yeah, this would have been almost twice that of Tenerife. It's insane. When you look at the situation, you go, oh my gosh, like this could have been the worst air crash to happen. And it really makes you think, how many of these incidents actually happen without us knowing? I thought about it after we got done with our Tenerife podcast. I mean, I really thought about that one for a while. And it makes you think, if one of those links had been broken, we would have never heard about it. And the only reason why we hear about these near misses or whatever they want to call them, close encounters, close calls, is because we have ADSB, we have live ATC, we have, like VAS Aviation and some of these other media outlets that bring these incidents to light. This is one of those cases. It was brought to the media light and people talked about it, which is good.
Right. And just again to illustrate how close we came to over 1,000. So the Air Canada was an Airbus A320, so not huge, equivalent to about a 737. United Airlines One was a 787-9 with 252 capacity. The Philippine had a 340-300 with 254. And there was another United Boeing 787-9 with 252. And finally, United Airlines 737-900 with 179. So it could have been a very bad night.
Yeah, we're talking, like you said, close to right around 1,000 people.
Okay, another thing mentioned in this accident is that San Francisco International was one of the first airports to install what's called an Airport Surface Surveillance Capability, ASSC. Have you read about that?
Yeah.
So what is that?
Basically, it'll tell them when there is a potential conflict if they feel like the aircraft has lined up with either the incorrect runway or an incorrect taxiway. So,
okay. Now, they had that this night. So what happened?
Honestly, I don't know.
Okay. Well, from what I've been able to read and study a little bit was that it disappeared from that system for about 11 seconds at a critical time. So, and also in the tower, because of the lateness and even though there were four airliners waiting and 5 involved in this, it was a very slow time for San Francisco. There was only one controller working both ground and tower, which is unusual.
That's not unusual. Not that late at night when traffic is typically slower, but I do know now that they don't allow that. That was one of the things
because of this?
Yes, that was one of the things that came out of the aftermath was they have to have at least 2 controllers. I know that another thing that came out of this as well is they're no longer allowed to issue visual approaches at night anymore.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
San Francisco.
Oh, at San Francisco.
Just at San Francisco, yeah, because of the way that the runways are and because of the optical illusions. It's just, you know what, just ILS. If it's at night, just give them the ILS. It's the safest course of action.
You mentioned earlier that you always put in a backup ILS or RNAV or whatever, and you've taught that. Is it standard procedure in the airlines, best practices to back up with an ILS?
Yes.
It is.
It is best practice to back up your visual approach with an instrument approach.
So the Air Canada pilots they broke procedures.
No, they did. I don't think that was I don't think that was in their guidance at the time. I think it is now. I do believe that they are either required or it's considered a best practice, but you got to remember, this happened back in 2017. A lot has changed since then because of this incident and others like it, especially with some of the new stuff coming out. All of these, close calls with the FedEx and the Southwest or the
first half of
incident
2023,
at JFK.
we've had a whole bunch of greatest accidents that never happened.
Right, exactly. So our operations manuals are being changed almost on a, monthly basis sometimes, and we talk about best practices and stuff like that. A lot of the airlines are looking at it. We learn from others. We don't just learn from ourselves and what we do wrong. We learn from others. And this is one of those situations where it may not have been best practice before, but I can tell you right now, it is certainly a best practice now.
Okay, so what's those are some of the ways they've changed. Anything else that we've changed the way we practice because of this near miss?
So when I was a full-time flight instructor, I would teach students, even primary students, how to use you do basic VOR training and stuff like that. I actually taught them how to tune in a localizer or how to load an approach into their GPS. So that way, for example, here in DFW on the west side, a lot of us here are familiar with the fact that Navy Carswell is very close to Fort Worth Meacham. And several times people land at Navy Carswell thinking that they're landing at Meacham because the runways are effectively parallel and the airports are not that far apart. And so I would teach my students, hey, it's a good idea to go ahead and back up your visual landing here with a localizer or with an RNAV, just to make sure that you are lined up for the correct runway. Because the last thing you need is to get a phone number because you landed at the wrong airport. So those are just things that we could do. Just remember, you can never be too cautious with these things. Even as airline pilots, we all make mistakes. We're human. We're not infallible. We think, it's no big deal, visual approach, going in at night. I've been to this airport a dozen times. You know what? Things happen. Runways get closed. You get last minute landing clearances or runway changes. And it's just always best to err on the side of caution.
And I know that one of the other things pulled from this particular incident was in Canada, the Canadian version of the FAA upped their fatigue standards because at that point, the Canadian pilots were legal, but the captain was at 19 hours since significant rest.
Right, which would have far exceeded our Part 117 rest requirements.
And so in 2018, Canada moved their standards up, and so now that's in place.
That's good.
So
yeah, I did know that too.
And the fatigue, what's interesting is, with 28 left closed, then that makes 28 right, and its taxiway to the right of it almost look like 28 left and right. And what the NTSB is saying is that the pilots, due to fatigue and not reading that 28 left was closed, all were contributing factors. They were all links in the chain.
Correct.
So,
but all it needed was just one link to be broken, and that thankfully that's what happened. Thank you to the pilots who were sitting on that taxiway who spoke up.
All right. Now, a similarity to the recent close call at JFK between the American Airlines international flight that had a runway incursion as a Delta plane was starting to take off. Well, what happened is American Airlines, had the runway incursion and then sat there for just a little bit and then went ahead and took off for Europe, for England. And because of that, of course, the cockpit voice recorder was overridden. Similar case here. That Airbus for Air Canada, they went on to do like 3 more flights right away. They were not told to hold those recordings. And so just like that JFK American Airlines, we have no idea if it was a distracted flight deck or not.
Right. Honestly, I've been there. Like, I've been, 4-leg day, it's late, you get there and you start feeling it. You kind of start feeling the fatigue and you're like, okay, I'm glad that we're going to the hotel after this or whatever. I don't think it was necessarily a distracted flight deck. I think that the likely scenario here was that they needed rest. They were impaired. They didn't realize that they were necessarily impaired, and they started making mistakes. And I believe that one of the contributing factors to them not backing up their visual approach with an ILS was that level of impairment that they had. I'm just so glad that they were able to break that link, come around, and then land. I mean, honestly, good on everybody involved. It's hard to place all this blame on the pilots. It's not just the pilots of the Air Canada who were at fault here. It was the system that was broken. Unfortunately, this is one that we learned not written in blood.
Right.
It was almost, but it wasn't. And I can only hope that future incidents like this, we can learn from and then make changes to prevent things from happening in the future.
Well, it sounds like, to me, I still place a significant responsibility on the pilots of Air Canada.
Oh, absolutely. I said we can't blame it all on them.
Not all on them, but significant amount.
I mean, absolutely. Yeah, they should have done certain things, but at the end of the day, yeah, the system was broken. The system is what placed them in that situation.
Whenever there's an NTSB investigation, be it an incident like this versus an accident or a crash, the NTSB, when they get involved, oftentimes they will make recommendations to the FAA. And a lot of people who don't understand think that that's just automatic, that, the NTSB is almost a synonym for the FAA, and it is not true. They're two totally different governmental organizations. And I would say the norm is for the NTSB to make recommendations that the FAA does not implement. And so there were recommendations from the NTSB from this in 2017 to increase the CVR recording time to 25 hours from its current 2. And clearly that hasn't, the FAA has not implemented that. So there's a lot of things the FAA or the NTSB will recommend that the FAA does not choose to implement. And for reason. It's not like they're just being rude or whatever. The FAA takes in a lot of different things into account as to why they may or may not take a recommendation from the NTSB. It could put an undue financial burden on pilots, or whatever. Yeah, I'm thinking more in general aviation terms, but there's a lot of things that happen that you got to consider all the ramifications, not just, oh, it's safety, why aren't they doing it? Why aren't they putting CVRs in every little Piper or Cessna aircraft out there?
Because there's bigger implications there. It
puts
adds
an undue
weight,
yeah.
it adds cost, et cetera. By the way, I just want to point out, I looked it up. That LAX runway collision I was talking about with the SkyWest, it was a U.S. Air, and it was in 1991.
1991.
Yeah. So that was another one that we could definitely talk about. That was one that actually did happen, though. And
right.
that was
not
terrible.
That was not a near miss. All right, so this was the worst accident that never happened.
The worst accident that never happened.
Okay, I'll leave this, close it with a quote from then chairman of the NTSB, Robert Sumwalt, who I've actually talked to before, and we've almost had him on the show, and maybe someday we will. Here's his quote I'm going to leave with, because in talking about the need to improve the NOTAM system that we have here, and recently went down in a mess as well. So here's his quote. It's a bunch of garbage that nobody pays attention to. And, the Air Canada pilots did not read the NOTAM that 28 left was closed and blah, blah, blah. It's because the NOTAM system is garbage. It's 38 pages of, there's a light out on a tower 16 miles from the airport, and it just gets lost, and we do need. What are your thoughts on that?
I really like the way, this is not a plug for ForeFlight, but I really like the way that ForeFlight breaks down the NOTAMs for pilots. And a lot of times I'll actually use ForeFlight before I begin a flight for work, because I like the way that it breaks it down. It says, hey, here's the NOTAMs that are for around the airport. These are the NOTAMs that are specific to the airport right now. It'll actually tell you because the NOTAMs also include things from the past, like previous, things that are coming up in the future. And ForeFlight does a really, really great job of breaking all that down, so that all I have to do is go to the correct tab and look and see, okay, the airport, all right, what's current right now? Okay, good. Now I know that this runway is closed. It really does, weeds through the garbage so that we can get to what we actually need versus the light on the tower 25 miles away from the airport.
All right, very good. Well, thank you guys for listening to this podcast of The Greatest Accident That Never Happened.
Greatest accident? You said greatest accident.
I know greatest as far as greatest tragedy, greatest number of fatalities.
I was just like, yeah, to me it's like the worst.
Okay, all right. So semantics. The worst. Thank you for joining us for listening to the worst accident that never happened. So appreciate you guys listening to our podcast. And if you're listening on YouTube, we'll throw some visuals up there. If you're listening on Spotify and Apple Music and all those other places, well, we won't have that.
You're just going to have to pretend.
Just pretend. You can always go to YouTube, though, leave us comments, and we appreciate you guys. And as always, thank you for listening.
See you next time.